At dusk, the warnings were still coming over the radio. Vacate your engine room. We are prepared to use disabling fire 6 hours later. In the dark, Marines came down by rope onto the deck of an Iranian-flagged cargo ship in the Arabian Sea. That is the image people will remember. Helicopters overhead, a disabled merchant vessel sitting dead in the water, armed men dropping out of the sky onto stacked containers at night. But the most dangerous part of that scene was not the boarding itself. The most dangerous part was the timing, because this did not happen after diplomacy had fully collapsed. It happened while everyone was still talking, as if diplomacy still existed. It happened while people were still arguing over whether talks were continuing, whether another meeting was coming, whether some kind of deal was still alive. And once you understand that, the real story changes immediately. The real story is not that America boarded one ship. The real story is that America took a military step that makes a political exit harder for every player at the table. Let me start with the ship itself, because the American side says the vessel ignored repeated warnings for roughly 6 hours. Then a destroyer disabled its propulsion. Only after that came the helicopter insertion, the night boarding, the seizure. In other words, this was not a random encounter. It was a staged escalation with multiple decision points built into it. Warning, delay, disabling fire, boarding, search, seizure, that sequence matters. Because this was not just enforcement, it was a message. And in a crisis like this, messages never stay with one audience. Tehran reads them one way, the Revolutionary Guard reads them another, shipping companies, Gulf states, and China read them in their own way. The moment you send a signal like this, it multiplies. If you board a ship like this after the diplomatic track is over, then it is part of a war. Still dangerous, still risky, but at least the political meaning is clear. If you do it while diplomacy is supposedly still alive, you create a credibility trap, because now every Iranian hardliner can say the same thing. They can say, look, this is what American diplomacy means. It means they talk in one room and board ships in another. It means they tell us to negotiate while proving that pressure, humiliation, and force remain the real policy. It means that every concession we make will be pocketed and every pause we offer will be used against us. That argument becomes far stronger after a boarding like this than it was before. And once that argument gets stronger inside Iran, the people trying to negotiate get weaker. That is the mechanism. That is the thing people keep missing. A military move does not just change the battlefield, it changes the internal balance of power on the other side. It changes who sounds credible, it changes who looks naive, it changes which faction gets to say, I told you. So that is why one boarding operation can do more damage to a peace process than 10 angry speeches. Now think about it from the Iranian side, not morally, not emotionally, just structurally. There are always at least two Irans in moments like this. There is the Iran that still wants room to talk because it knows the economic damage is real, the pressure is real, and another round of war could be worse than the last one. And there is the Iran that thinks talking only buys the other side time, exposes weakness, and invites more pressure. When the Americans board a ship in the middle of this ambiguity, they do not weaken both Irans equally. They weaken the Iran that still wants to negotiate. They strengthen the Iran that says negotiation is a trap. That is why the move is not just dangerous at sea. It is dangerous inside the politics of the country America is trying to force into a deal. And then there is the second layer. What exactly has America gained? That question matters because once you choose a risky military move in the middle of a diplomatic window, the return had better be extraordinary. Maybe the ship was carrying something strategically valuable. Maybe intelligence suggested the cargo mattered. Maybe Washington believed the seizure would expose a weapons line, embarrass Tehran, or deter future shipments. But even if that is true, the next question is still the same. At what cost? Because a boarding like this creates a whole tree of bad options. If the cargo turns out to be meaningful, then America has publicly escalated and handed Iran a reason to retaliate. If the cargo turns out to be less meaningful than implied, then America has taken a dramatic military step for a result that looks thin. If the crew resists, someone dies and the crisis widens. If the crew does not resist, America still owns a crippled ship in contested waters and now has to decide what comes next. Tow it where, search how much of it, hold the crew for how long. What if some of the crew are not Iranian? What if Chinese-linked commercial interests sit somewhere inside a chain of shell companies, front firms, and rerouted paperwork? This is what I mean by a bad options tree. You can climb it, but every rung gets uglier, and that is before we even get to the physical problem. A disabled merchant ship is not a speech, it is not a press release, it is a giant, slow, exposed object sitting near a hostile coastline in a region full of drones, missiles, speedboats, and political actors who would love to turn an operational headache into a strategic humiliation. It is easy to create the footage. It is much harder to own everything that comes after the footage. That is another reason this move was dangerous. It created a spectacular moment before it solved the practical problem. And in the Middle East, spectacular moments have a way of outrunning the people who staged them. Now bring China into it, because this story does not stop with America and Iran. We still do not know exactly what was on the ship. We do not know how much of the cargo chain touches China directly, indirectly, or deniably. But even the possibility matters, because the commercial architecture around Iran has been built for years on layers of distance, intermediaries, flags of convenience, rerouted paperwork, and deniable ownership. That is how pressure is absorbed. That is how sanctioned trade survives. That is how everyone pretends not to see what they can plainly see. So when a ship is boarded in this environment, the problem is not only what is physically on the deck, the problem is what political chain reaction follows. If China openly claims the cargo, the crisis expands. If China denies involvement, the ambiguity remains. If the cargo is linked to Chinese supply indirectly, then Washington has not solved the China problem at all. It has simply stepped closer to it without naming it. And that is the larger strategic failure hanging over all of this. America keeps acting as if the Iran problem can be isolated from the China problem. It cannot. Iran is harder to pressure because it is not standing alone. Not because China is firing missiles beside it, not because China is openly entering the war, but because China has spent years helping build the outer architecture that lets Iran breathe under pressure. Money routes, shipping layers, diplomatic cover, commercial deniability, strategic patience. That support changes what pressure can accomplish. It means that a blockade is not automatically decisive. It means that escalation has a ceiling. It means the other side can often wait longer than Washington expects. And when Washington ignores that reality, it starts compensating with theater. That is how you end up with a boarding that looks strong on video while making the strategic picture messier. I want to stay with the timing one more time, because I think this is where the whole thing turns. Why do this while talks are still being discussed? There are only a few answers, and none of them are reassuring. One possibility is impatience. Washington thinks pressure must keep rising or the other side will stall. Another is disbelief. Washington still thinks the military signal can be separated from the diplomatic track, as if the people across the table will compartmentalize what just happened and keep negotiating normally. Another is domestic politics. A dramatic move creates an image of control, initiative, and toughness when the broader picture remains uncertain. And the final possibility is the dark one that some people no longer believe a real deal is closed, so they are positioning for the collapse while still talking publicly as if diplomacy exists. Any of those explanations should worry you, because none of them describes a stable road to peace. And once you see that, the footage looks different. It stops looking like a neat tactical success and starts looking like a sign that the political center of gravity is moving away from an exit. That does not mean war is inevitable tomorrow. It does mean the people arguing for a harder line just received a gift. In Tehran, they can point to the ship. In Washington, they can point to the ship. On television, everybody can point to the ship. And once a crisis starts being organized around a symbol like that, it becomes harder for quieter, less dramatic, more humiliating compromises to survive. That is the real danger here. Not that one vessel was boarded, not that one operation happened at night, not even that the footage was dramatic. The real danger is that the image now outruns the diplomacy. It becomes easier to escalate than to explain restraint. It becomes easier to threaten than to compromise. It becomes easier for every side to say the other side has already shown its true face. And when that happens, events start choosing the leaders instead of leaders choosing the events. So what happens next? Iran can retaliate directly, indirectly. If it retaliates directly, the crisis jumps. If it retaliates indirectly through harassment, drones, proxies, or shipping pressure, the crisis stretches. If it does not retaliate immediately, that does not mean the danger is gone. It may simply mean Tehran is deciding when and where the answer should come. America now has to manage the ship, the crew, the cargo narrative, the diplomatic fallout, and the signal it just sent to allies, rivals, and markets. China does not need to do anything dramatic. It can do what it often does best. Watch, deny, distance, wait, and let America move one step deeper into a problem whose outer edges still are not fully defined. That is why I keep coming back to the same sentence. The dangerous move was not the boarding itself. The dangerous move was choosing a piece of military theater that makes a political exit narrower. Because the moment Marines came down onto that deck, America was no longer just boarding a ship. It was boarding the negotiation. And once you do that, the question is no longer whether the operation looked strong. The question is whether it left anyone an easier way out. I do not think it did. I think it made the room smaller, the factions harsher, the diplomacy weaker, and the next move more dangerous than the last one. And in this kind of crisis, that is how real mistakes begin. The moment one side convinces itself that a dramatic image is the same thing as strategic progress. The most dangerous thing America boarded that night was not an Iranian ship. It was its own exit ramp.